Even prior to the first African-American president being elected to the United States, whenever the economy begins to go down, hate groups see that as a grand opportunity to recruit. If you go back and look at what happened during the 70s, when the economy began to go down, right at the beginning of the 80s, Ronald Reagan gets elected into office. Family farmers are losing their homes at record numbers. They're in rural areas, they're trying to figure out what's going on. And as a result, what you have is people that for generations have farmed, and they've played by the rules. They made sure they worked hard, they raised their children with good, strict values. They took care of their families, their children married their high school sweethearts, and they go on to become farm families as well. All of a sudden, the wrench that gets thrown in the works is the economy tanks. The family farm is now up for auction. The bankers have come in and foreclosed, and I don't know why. It also applies in other areas. For instance, third generation people working on the assembly line for the automobile company. Again, they played by the rules. My dad said if I graduate from high school and play on a football team to distinguish myself a bit, then I can go to work in the local General Motors factory. And many families and generations have done that. Again, they married their high school sweetheart, they raised middle class families and so forth, but the same thing happens. The economy tanks, they're trying to figure out what happened. We played by the rules, and now I'm given a pink slip and don't have a job anymore. Then you have the right-wing extremists, even hate groups stepping in. In the family farm case, it was groups like PRIYA, the arm, the sword, the shield, and the arm of the Lord. You had the posse comitatus. You had factions of the Klan. Showing up on the doorstep to those confused people were asking the question, what happened? And they're saying, well, you know what happened? And this is old terminology, you have to look this up and whatnot. They say this is all because of a, quote, Zionist-occupied government and their African-American field soldiers that are doing their dirty work for them. And it begins to expand from there. The point is that what we have is not only that old style thing, and our report shows that you have these old groups like the Council of Conservative Citizens, the White Citizens Council, the used to be the old White Citizens Council. You have the Klan, you have the posse comitatus again being involved, the White Aryan Resistance, all utilizing the fertile ground that's been created by an organization called the Tea Party. There's really many, many different organizations. Our report will also show you the Tea Party's 6 different national sects, and that many of the local so-called Tea Party groups are not even affiliated with any of those sects. They call themselves that. We also show the direct correlation between the leadership of some of these established hate groups and the leadership sprinkled throughout some of the Tea Party sects throughout the country as well. They're using it as that fertile soil. So the bottom line is we recognize what's going on. The only thing that's added to that is actually really fed into, you know, this nasty scenario that these extremists are playing is now you have an African-American president of the United States. And for those of us who remember when I believe it was Strom Thurmond ran for re-election in South Carolina against an African-American, no, I'm sorry, it was Jesse Helms, against an African-American man. He played the race card in such a hardcore, extreme way. At a time when the economy was going down, he showed a white hand balling up a pink slip and blaming it on people like Harvey Gantt, who was the African-American candidate that ran, which then invoked the images that we're seeing now, the types of images we're now seeing attributed to those from the South Asian community. You're terrorists, those who look like you are out to destroy the country, and then the double whammy for them is they can play on the old existing stereotypes they created around African Americans, and the brother's middle name is Hussein. So you're playing it through in a way that, again, it creates that perfect storm. It allows them to attack. You've got to set things up. There's no saying that in order to have a fight, you've got to step into the ring. And these are people that create the ring so that they can actually maximize their involvement in having this particular fight.
Thank you so much, Hillary. And that's a new report that the NAACP's released, right?
Absolutely. It's on our website at NAACP.org. It's called Tea Party Nationalism. Tea Party Nationalism is the name of the report. If you get a chance, and interestingly enough, this report was actually written by the former director of research for the Center for Democratic Renewal, one of the renowned anti-hate research organizations in the country.
I'm going to see if we have a couple more questions so we can get more of them out. So, Afshan, who's got the mic?
Thanks. The report's really great. I think it pulls together a lot of different things that you've seen, that you've obviously been tracking over the years in a coherent narrative. I was listening to my Rachel Maddow podcast the other day, and because I don't watch it on TV, and she talked about, she asked the question why we haven't had a macaca moment in this election, right? And she talked about, you know, she pulled a couple of examples of things that could have been the macaca moment, like some of the crazy things that have been said. I may not say crazy, but you know, some of the really inappropriate things that have been said, right, throughout the course of this campaign. I mean, to me, the answer is because it doesn't fit the narrative, like the media narrative of, oh, it's a tidal wave election, it's, you know, so because it's being said by people who are part of the tidal wave, right? So to me, the macaca moment was part of that narrative, right? It was part of, it was going the other way, and so that's why it fit the narrative, and people were able to talk about it. But I wanted to know what you all thought would be the answer to that question. Like, why haven't we had, despite the fact that there are no dumb questions, but there are plenty of dumb people asking them, why haven't we had a macaca moment in this election yet?
And when you say that, Ben, you're asking why haven't people who say these comments been held accountable in some ways?
I think so. Like
George Allen.
Right. Why hasn't there been sort of a, you know, people who have been held to account in the same way?
Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering if any of you want to take that, PRIYA, ARSALAN?
Well, I think one of the reasons that we haven't had a macaca moment is because George Allen isn't running for anything. You know, I think that, you know, people say stupid things all the time, and politicians say stupid things all the time, and I think that, you know, a lot of, you know, sort of piggybacking off what Hillary said, you know, in terms of the Tea Party, I sort of liken it to what we are seeing in many European countries today with the rise of right-wing, nationalistic, jingoistic parties. You know, you have the BNP in the United Kingdom. You have politicians like Jean-Marie Le Pen in France that are sort of, they're sort of pandering to nativist, anti-immigrant sentiment as sort of the cause of all their woes, both economic, social, foreign policy. And I personally believe that the Tea Party is sort of that manifestation. They're sort of our jingoistic party, or jingoistic faction, if you will, within American politics today. Having said that, I think that's probably one of the reasons that we haven't seen a macaca moment is because there has now sort of become a critical mass of people that have been saying enough outlandish things. You know, they're not part of the mainstream Republican Party. You know, you have the RNC leadership, and you know, for example, I mean, Michael Steele, for you know all his shortcomings as a manager. I mean, you know, they can sort of hide behind the fact that, you know, well, they're not part of the, you know, Sharon Angle in Nevada saying loony things, or Christine O'Donnell in Delaware. You know, it was funny because recently, you guys may not have heard this, but Christine O'Donnell was actually endorsed by one of the right-wing bloggers who like sort of started the whole Park 51 debate, and Christine O'Donnell actually turned down her endorsement. So my thing is, dude, if you're getting turned down by Christine O'Donnell, you must really be out there. But again, you know, the Republicans sort of have political cover in the sense that, well, you know, they're outside the fold of the mainstream Republican Party, but they get to reap the political benefits because obviously, as we know, you know, all this sort of, you know, xenophobic stuff is being said by people who tilt to the right politically. And so it's, you know, they're having their cake and eating it too. And so I think, sadly, I think the reason we have not had a macaca moment again is because we've sort of reached a critical mass where, you know, people are saying things left and right so much now that we really are becoming desensitized to them.
No, I strongly agree with that. I think that a macaca moment is kind of a gotcha moment too. And it's the assumption that what's being said is so far out of the mainstream that we got you. you know, you call somebody a racial slur, open, and we got you. And in the case of Alan some time ago, it was in the midst of a little bit more calm than we have now, but it's all relative. It's a good way of thinking about it, because you're absolutely right. Don't forget, the Tea Party kicked out a number of Republicans that I didn't think were by anybody's means moderate. You know, when you talk about, you know, Mr. Bennett in Utah, he was not a moderate. But it kind of depends on how broad the sampling is, and then where this person falls within that guise of the sampling. So I agree with you, and I think what we're saying is there have been many, you know, one way of arguing is that there have been so many Macaca moments that it's just become the norm. And the sad reality is how people are talking about these things. I mean, your report, this doesn't, if you just pull out the excerpts from here, and I think they've done a wonderful job of pulling out samplings and whatnot, but I know this isn't everything that's there. And if you look at even go to the NAACP's website, you'll see the kind of signs that have been displayed at Tea Party Express rallies all over the country. You've got the use of the N-word. You've got the President of the United States photoshopped into a voodoo witch doctor. You've got the President of the United States being photoshopped into being a monkey. Now look, hey, monkey was one of the most awful things that you could say about an African American in this country and whatnot, comparing it again to those that are less than human. But because it gets utilized so often now, that's considered the more subtle thing. The only thing that'll get you is going to have to be something stronger than macaca these days. I mean, it requires, I don't know what the euphemistic term for the N-word is within the Asian community, but you're going to have to come up with it and whatnot, because that is, quite frankly,
It's called Muslim.
Unfortunately, that could be a major problem. But it is an unfortunate reality. But we have to keep pointing out, I think, it's a problem as well. We're letting others define for us which of these terms means what to our communities. And unless we stand up as an African American community, the Asian community, and other communities and say, look, this is absolutely outrageous. When SAALT says that this is one of the worst things you can say about our folks and whatnot, that's when it's going to make a tremendous difference. And when we say, as we define ourselves, that this word is offensive and you shouldn't be able to use it.
The only thing that I would add to what has been said before is that I think that we're in a situation right now where there isn't really seen as there being a political advantage to take the higher ground on these types of issues. So when you have, you know, one side using, you know, xenophobic or racist terms, the other side, as others have mentioned before, it's kind of the norm. So there's not really any political gain that you get out of saying that that's wrong. So what happened with the George Allen incident is obviously the opponent actually spread that virally, and that's how, you know, it got more attention in the mainstream, and that's why it was slammed and condemned. But I think on what we tried to show in the report is that on both sides of the aisle in this current climate that we're living in, both parties are engaging in this type of activity. So it makes it difficult for when individuals or community members are trying to raise awareness about it, for it to gain traction, both within the media but also within the political parties itself. So I think that's the only thing I would add to what was said earlier.
Thank you. I think we can take maybe, wow, there are a lot of people raising their hands. So we'll take a couple more, and then I'm going to ask a closing question. And should we ask? Yes, go ahead.
Okay.
You've got the mic.
Just Jason, Sick American Legal Defense and Education Fund. Thank you again for putting on this wonderful program, very timely put. My question for the panelists is, how do we get those who are kind of in positions to move the rhetoric the other direction, those in the media we talked a little bit about, but as well political figures, to understand that by remaining complacent and on the sidelines as others are bombasting a negative message out to the media, how do we get them to understand that by being complacent you're being part of the problem? And I ask this in the context of President Obama's, the current kind of hot story is whether he'll visit the Harmandir Sahib, popularly known as the Golden Temple in India. And so I'm curious to know your thoughts about that.
That's a very good question, and it's something that Priya, you know, sort of alluded to as well. Basically, Democrats have to grow a spine. You know, sadly, you know, the Republicans and the conservatives have literally controlled the message on this, you know, to the point where any sort of even remote defense or something that seems like a defense you know, is going to be lambasted to the point where, you know, Democrats are essentially running at the first, you know, sight of blood. You know, something that the whole Park 51 debate, you know, President Obama held a Ramadan iftar at the White House where he spoke actually, you know, very strongly in favor of the religious freedom of all Americans. You know, next day at a press gaggle, he sort of walked that back. And the Republicans smelled the blood in the water right there. You know, if our commander-in-chief was equivocating and triangulating, then certainly, you know, they could attack, you know, without any sort of consequence. You know, during the 2008 presidential campaign, you know, when the whisper campaigns were going out that, you know, Barack was some sort of, you know, crypto-Muslim Manchurian candidate, it wasn't until a Republican, former Secretary of State Colin Powell, went on Meet the Press that the Republicans actually shut up about it. You know, Colin Powell went on Meet the Press and he said, well, first of all, even if he was a Muslim, which he's not, so what? You know, we live in a country where any person can become the president. But it took a member of their own party to, you know, to essentially shut the Karl Rove machine up. And that's similar to what we're seeing today. You know, the Democrats, and a lot of this has to do with just the insecurity of the midterm elections. I mean, the Democrats, they have the bejesus scared out of them that they're going to lose the majority in the House. They won't lose in the Senate, but they don't want to lose. And so, you know, the last thing they're going to do is, you know, try to stand up for a bunch of brown people that are pretty unpopular nationally in terms of public opinion because of what Fox News is saying. And so, you know, I mean, you know, I'm a proud, bleeding heart liberal Democrat, and I'll be the first one to say that the Democratic Party today are a bunch of wusses. And you know, we live in D.C. and we play, you know, we're in the game of professional politics, and it's a contact sport. And the Republicans are a well-oiled machine.
And I would only add that I think we have to go to the source again and not presume that people are as educated on these issues as they'd like to pretend to be. I think you have a great report. I think you have a very well-crafted analysis of the challenges to the South Asian communities. When we see that we're having a problem with the television stations and the newspapers or the media, we can sit down with the editorial boards and those that are actually shaping policies for those organizations and tell them why it's a problem. And then hold a press conference and tell everybody else what we just told them. In essence, we move away from, that way they won't be able to dismiss us by saying we're playing gotcha politics. You know, everybody's looking at that gotcha moment and whatnot. Well, it's just a split, this, that, and the other. But if you sat down and explained it and actually laid down your terrain for how this should be perceived, then there should be no excuse. Quite frankly, I think it's time to ask for a meeting with Michael Steele and with Governor Kane and explain to both parties. I know how the Republicans play the game and how the Democrats play the game. We get on the Democrats for not having a spine, and oftentimes they don't. We get on the Republicans for having so much of a spine, but not allowing anybody else in the tent because they don't. In essence, there's a kind of a different problem that still ends up resulting in the same things that we're experiencing. So it's time to go sit down and talk to Michael Steele. It's time to go and sit down and talk to Governor Kane and explain to them both why it is their parties are going to have to stop this. And then I think it makes very good sense to speak to the majority and the minority leaders in the House and the Senate as well, because this kind of rhetoric should not be acceptable to be utilized on the floor of the House or the Senate either. You know what I'm saying? So we're going to have to be very proactive about it and very clear and concise. We're going to be responsive, saying we've got a problem. I think you've done a wonderful job of laying it out and actually quantifying it very well. But we also have a solution in what you can address, what you can and cannot do. We've been parts of groups that have invited us in the NAACP, and they said, listen, we just want to ask a question. You know, I get people all the time saying, how do we refer to black people these days? Is it okay to say they're black? You know, it means that on one hand, we pride ourselves on having created a scenario where somebody feels like they're compelled to have to ask because they don't want to make that mistake. But it's also important for us to be able to answer. And I think it's important that as we talk about the results of the report, we do the same.
Thank you. And just really quickly on the Sikh temple issue, which occurred well after we went to print on this report, I wanted to point out that for folks who are interested in that, both SAALT, the Sikh Coalition and United Sikhs have really put out some analysis and information about it. So I encourage you to look at their websites if you're interested in learning more. We have one last question, and then obviously folks are going to stay for a little bit, I think, if you all want to come up and ask more. Yes.
Thanks very much. Once again, thanks to SAALT for putting this together. This has been the most informative discussion on these issues that I've heard in a very long time. This panel should probably be on CNN right now. I'm not sure where they are. So I have, just real quick, in response to the question earlier about the Islamophobia cottage industry, there's actually a brand new report out, pretty sure it's in the Tennessean newspaper, describing how one of the most virulent Islamophobic rhetoric personalities may be using his nonprofit organization as a front for a for-profit enterprise. It's worth watching to see whether this develops into a court case. So it quite literally is an industry, unfortunately. But I'd also like to, for my question, extend what the gentleman from SALDEF just said, which is we need to think about ways that we can change the political rhetoric. And I think that SALT is a key organization doing that. I wonder if you could describe for us some of the ways that your organization or organizations that you work with, number one, build coalitions to counter the coalition that the Tea Party represents, as the report from NAACP so brilliantly illuminates. But also building coalitions, and if this is an election year, as your report points out, much of the rhetoric that we see like this comes in election years. Is there any get out the vote, community organizing type of work that's being done by SALT or other organizations that you partner with? I wonder if you could describe some of that for us here.
Thank you for your question, and actually I think maybe what we could do is have each of you respond from your own vantage point to kind of close on this question and close our briefing out in terms of what do you think civil rights organizations need to be doing in order to really stem the tide of xenophobia and racism. Priya, do you want to start?
Yeah, so just to give a few examples in the past in terms of how our organization has responded to this, and I think it's definitely key to do it in coalition with other communities and other organizations. In the past, when we have responded to these types of statements, whether it's individual statements or if it's more broadly about approaching the political parties about the types of rhetoric that's used, we've always done it in partnership with other organizations, whether it's the coalition that we coordinate of South Asian organizations, the National Coalition of South Asian Organizations, or with other communities of color within the Asian American community, or with the Arab, Muslim, Sikh, South Asian communities, because I think it shows the broader message that I think you're getting at, which is that, you know, our communities are sizable, our communities have a voice, and although we may not say it explicitly, you know, we are your constituents, and we are someone that you should be accountable to. So that's why we believe just going in alone doesn't work. We have to go with so many others. And I think moving forward is just probably going to get worse before it gets better. So I think as each organization that works in the civil rights arena continues to address these issues, I think we have to expand our reach in building coalitions, because we're seeing how connected the rhetoric is used against Muslims, against African Americans, against Latinos. The stronger the coalitions are, the more effective our voice to counter these types of rhetoric will be.
Let me say that we're part of a broader coalition that was created some time ago called the Leadership Conference on Civil, and now Civil and Human Rights. We've taken on issues like this as a coalition because many of our organizations are members already. It's a very diverse coalition that brings together racial and ethnic minority groups, women's groups, labor unions, religious organizations, and others to work on issues of policy concerns that we all kind of share. So in essence, when things like this happen, we feel like we need to respond as a coalition, addressing the same issue with many voices. That gives us a great opportunity to do it. As we look at issues of how we move forward in this election, we want to make sure there's a massive turnout of people coming out, because there's an agenda at stake that we so much support. It's one, you can say very well, it's colored by the kind of xenophobia we're talking about today in so many ways. There's so many distractions, and for those political operatives that would utilize whatever they have at their availability to make it to actually prevent us from continuing to move forward on important issues like health care reform, financial services protections and reform in our country, education reform and other issues and problems, and even criminal justice reform issues that still need to be addressed. If we are distracted by too many sideline points and don't realize that we have to only address those as we continue to move towards the major concern in front of us, that is the agenda that's good for all Americans, regardless of your race, gender, ethnicity, and that everyone, regardless of the race, gender, ethnicity, or point of national origin, should be able to share in the promise of America. Is what all of this is about. When we have these conversations, it is always to shave off one group or another. Well, some of us should be able to have good health care and a place to live and a great job to work at, and to be able to start a small business and maintain it if we want to, and not have to be victimized by a discriminatory criminal justice system. But not you all, because we've decided that you're different. You're not really American. You're not really a part of what the American dream is all about. You're just sitting here to sleep for a little while, wake up in the cell and go after the rest of it because you hate America. And that's why you sold off everything you had in the country you came from, risk coming to a country that you didn't even speak the language, but believed in the promise. And at least the propaganda that country put forward why it's such a great place for everybody to live. I mean facetious, of course. But it's taking on those issues that we have to do. So full participation in this electoral process is absolutely essential. What we've done in moving in that direction is make sure people understand exactly what is at stake. And again, if you go to our website, you'll see what we've won so far. You'll also see what is at stake. And the last piece, the three-pronged piece, what we must do. Voter registration, in most places, the registration period is over. Some places it's still going on. Voter education, knowing what the issues are, knowing what's at stake, and not allowing them to either distort the issue or even shout so loud as we saw happening, being illustrated by Tea Party operatives, to prevent an informed discussion from being able to happen in the first place. If you don't allow the real issues to come forward, then the lies and distortions that were thrown out there will be allowed to prevail. So indeed, we have to take on those, and finally, we got to protect that vote. And one of the reasons I'm happy to sit here at this table is I know we have people at this table that have been involved in our election protection process in the past. We know how this program works now. We used to think as long as we get people registered, educated, and to the polls, the job was done. 2000, we learned a very difficult and painful lesson. But they'll steal your vote out the back door in a hot second. And indeed, that's part of our struggle and how we move forward with this issue as well. And NAACP.org has all this material laid out for anybody that wants it.
Two things very quickly. Number one, coalitions. And number two, if there's one takeaway that you guys all take away from today, or from any discussion, it's that the protection of the civil rights of one American is the protection of all Americans. Today it's South Asians, tomorrow it could be anti-Latino sentiment, homophobic sentiment, anti-black, anti-Semitism. If you hear xenophobia of any kind, speak up. Doesn't matter who you are, what you look like, who the victim is, what they look like. We need to reinstill a culture of humanity back into our world and back into our country. And until we create one standard where hatred towards one is seen as hatred towards all, we are still going to have a long way to go.
Thank you so much. And I think that that's exactly what we're trying to do today, to try to reinsert, or at least call for a return to humanity and civility. So I wanted to close really quickly with a few points. One is, I know that we've talked a lot about how this rhetoric impacts public opinion, but it's important to remember that it also affects policy. And so policies are being shaped each day that use some of these sentiments as their cornerstone. So really wanted to kind of point that out as well. Finally, I wanted to ask all of you to take some actions when you return to your offices and homes. Let people know that this report exists. Talk about it, blog about it, write about it. I know many of you are working at other civil rights organizations. Please include a piece about it in your newsletters. It would be great if the information got out as widely as possible. And finally, I wanted to just do some thank yous. First, I wanted to really thank ARSALAN and HILARY for taking the time to be here and lend your perspective. I know that we're all enriched by it and hope that we can continue to work together. I also wanted to do a thank you to the amazing SAALT staff, and if you could raise your hand when I call your name so that folks know who you are. I first wanted to acknowledge Afshan Koja, our new communications manager, who joined us about 3 weeks ago when I was told to do this. So she did a fantastic job. I also wanted to thank PRIYA, obviously, who wrote a lot of this report. Mary Syriac, who's back there, who also contributed to this report. I wanted to thank Mo, who does a great job making sure that we get everything right all the time. Rahma, Sufi back there, Vega Subramaniam, and Rachna. So all these people did a fantastic job in pulling this together. And I wanted to thank all of you for coming out this afternoon, and look forward to talking with you a little bit more today and at other future events. Thank you so much, and have a good afternoon.